Amen. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Zion Temple. And to my pastor, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity, as with every opportunity that you give us. To our ministers who are here tonight, beautiful are your feet, and may God continue to bless you in ministry. To all of our members and listening friends here and on Zoom or on ztmbc.com, God bless you and thank you for coming tonight. We're going to get right into the word tonight. Tonight, of course, we are in the New Testament, as our pastor has requested, and our scripture can be found, Mark, the 5th chapter, the 34th verse. And he said unto her, "Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace and be whole of thy plague." Our subject for tonight, the woman with the issue of blood, a perfect example of how Jesus elevated the status of women everywhere he went. Now, Jesus was quite the radical in his day, folks. He was always doing something unusual, always doing something that was just the opposite of how those high holy men of his day would do it. First of all, he taught using parables, usually involving farming, so that the people of his day, most of whom were members of an agricultural society, a farming community, could process what he was saying and understand it. It wasn't hidden or coded language. It was easy to understand, even for us today. And if you listened to it and you didn't understand, then that probably meant that he was talking about you, like the scribes or the Pharisees. Most of the time, they didn't even want to understand. But Jesus talked to everybody, including the people nobody else wanted to talk to. Now, this is ancient Israel, you all, where you could easily be shunned for any disease or condition that was or wasn't your fault. It might not necessarily be your fault, but if you are the one that currently has it, don't touch nobody, don't speak to nobody, stay over there. You were isolated. But oh no, that didn't matter to Jesus. From the lepers to the tax collectors, from the wayward women to the lame and the blind, Jesus talked to everybody, even the dead. You might say, what? Yes, he did. What did he say to Jairus' daughter? Talitha Kumi, little girl, get up. And to the widow of Nain's son, young man, I say unto thee, arise. And y'all all know what he said to Lazarus. I know y'all know. What did he say? Lazarus, come forth. So Jesus even talked to the dead. He wasn't afraid of getting sick. He wasn't afraid of being called unclean. He displayed a behavior that was rad. Y'all know what that means. You know, the kids say rad instead of radical. He was rad, completely different from any of the holy men of that day. Let me tell y'all, another very important part of Jesus's ministry was that he was seen talking to women and talking to women all the time. He talked to them anywhere. He talked to them at the well. He talked to them at the supper table. He allowed them to sit at his feet and hear him teach. They were even allowed to sit and stand in the crowds to hear him preach. He talked to them unchaperoned. He talked to them some of them mixed races or other races. He didn't care what people said or thought about it. In some respects, his behavior would be seen as scandalous in that culture. But he didn't care, not Jesus. He had a job to do. And you can see it in his words and in his actions. When he engaged with a woman, he never left them where they were. Each woman that found herself in conversation with Jesus would be given the information or the tools or the healing or deliverance, the saving that she needed at that moment, and would be capable of sharing that good news with someone else. His treatment of women was radical, to the point of being revolutionary. He pushed past the boundaries of his culture for the sake of women. He was bringing them out of the shadows of their homes into public life. He was showing them that God has created them in his image, and they also had a right to salvation and deliverance. There was not an instance where Jesus disgraces or belittles a woman, other than that Syrophoenician woman, but that was, low for her faith, just to build it up. But you will never hear a word of reproach or stereotyping of women. He is constantly liberating and affirming women, showing them who they are in the eyes of God. Now, today we're going to take a look at the woman with the issue of blood. Because here again, we see Jesus calling out, giving a shout out, like the kids say. He's recognizing another person that he has encountered with great faith. Remember that? Jesus always liked to recognize or shout out great faith. And he not only gives her a shout out regarding her faith, he elevates her status by using a name that includes her in the family of God. Nobody can shun her again after that day because he calls her daughter. Now, the story of the woman with the issue of blood can be found in the three synoptic gospels. They are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're called synoptic gospels because the timelines of their stories usually align, and they are similar in the way that they tell the story. Each of them begin the same way. Now, I call Matthew the microwave version of this particular incident. Matthew is like a hit it and quit it. He says, behold, a woman diseased with the issue of blood for 12 years came behind him. That's the beginning of his story. Now, Luke gives a little more information about her when he says, and a woman having an issue of blood for 12 years, which has spent all of her living upon physicians, neither could be healed or came behind him. And they're talking about came behind Jesus. And Mark starts off the story this way, and he gives us the most descriptive version of this woman when he says, and a certain woman which had an issue of blood 12 years and has suffered many things of many physicians and has spent all that she had and was nothing better, but rather grew worse. He's talking about her in more detail than either of the other two. But now, as we listen to all three of them, we know a little bit more about this woman because each of them kind of describe her in a different way, Mark being the most extensive. And we'll get into the details of the rest of the story later, but as she gets close enough to Jesus to touch the hem of his garment. But isn't that interesting to you all that she touched the hem of a garment? That's the tiniest part, the hem. And then you know that there must be some supernatural power in that hem for a person to just be able to touch it and be healed. And get this, y'all, you not only have to be super powerful to heal with just the hem of your garment. You're not putting your hands on anybody. They just touch the hem of your garment. You got to be super sensitive to know that somebody touched you and that some of your virtue, your healing power went out of you. That's Jesus. And on top of that, she had to have some kind of faith to believe that if I could just get close enough and if I could just touch his hem, I'm going to be healed. What kind of crazy faith is that? That's some kind of faith. Most of us would have stayed at home saying, oh, no, I ain't gonna be bothered with all them crowds today. I don't think so. No way I can get close enough to see him, let alone touch him. So you would have needed to have faith enough to get up and go, first of all. And if that's not enough, imagine all the scornful looks from the people that she got, especially the ones that knew she was sick. Imagine the things they would say. Girl, look over there. What's she doing here? And some of them bold enough to say it to her face. Honey, do you think the rabbi, the Son of God, Savior of the whole world, is here to heal you? And I can imagine her answer, poor little humble thing, because of her great faith. When they asked that question, she could probably look at him and say, yeah. And I don't know if he will heal me, but I know he can. Don't you just love that? And she kept it moving. She kept moving forward. Now, that's the kind of faith she had, and she wouldn't be turned around. Now, can you imagine her getting closer and closer to him? And she probably encountered more of that type of behavior. Girl, get back. Don't touch us. Do you really think the rabbi will put his hands on you? You are diseased. You're unclean. He ain't gonna touch you. And she probably thought to herself, he ain't gonna touch me because I'm gonna touch him. She had her mind made up, didn't she? Now, remember, she had made up her mind that if I could touch the hem of his garment, I could be made whole. So she kept it moving. She kept moving forward, because if you think about the logistics, she had to catch up with Jesus and them first. And then she had to get behind Jesus, because that's where the Synoptic Gospels say that she landed, behind him, in order to reach and to touch him, according to what she planned to do. So I imagine she reached the crowd around him and got down real low. And then she reached under there, and then she just touched that hem of his garment. And then she backed up, because instantly she was made whole. She knew she was healed. And she would have gotten away, except Jesus felt it and stopped. Now, in both Mark and Luke, Jesus said that he perceived that virtue had gone out of him. Now, Matthew, with his microwave version of the event, didn't have time for Jesus to ask questions or have the disciples talk back. Matthew's version was like, he turned around, and when he saw her, he said, daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith has made thee whole. I'm done. That was Matthew's version. But let's go to Mark and Luke, because I like to hear what the disciples have to say about anything. Because y'all know we're like the disciples. We got questions. So they're all in the middle of this crowd being pushed forward, because, everybody wanted to stick with Jesus. They knew he was on his way to Jairus's house. They knew Jairus's daughter was at the point of death, and everybody wanted to see what Jesus was going to do. So he being pushed around in this crowd, pushed and shoved. And then Jesus stops and said, who touched me? So they all looked at him like, what? Everybody in the crowd started saying, not me, not me. Luke's version says, when all had denied, here comes Peter and the rest of them, saying, Master, the multitude throng thee and press thee, and says, thou who touched me? That's KJV. Now, Mark's version doesn't single out Peter, but in the CEB, it reads like we would read it today. They all asked him, his disciples, said, don't you see the crowd pressing against you? Yet you ask, who touched me? But Jesus persisted. Their not believing him didn't stop him for a moment. He wanted to continue to look around at that crowd. It also becomes a teachable moment for the disciples. So Jesus stopped to explain to them why he knew he had been touched. He knew someone had touched him because he felt it. He felt the virtue had gone out of him. The healing power, that's what he means by the virtue, had gone out of him. Supernatural power had been taken out of him. He knew God's power had gone out of him. Now you ought to know, you can't steal God's power. And Jesus wanted to know where it went. And when she saw, this is the lady with the issue of blood, and when she saw that she could no longer be hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him. Now, if this were one of the rabbis or leaders of the synagogue, she would have been scorned for touching anyone. And a rabbi, she might have been stoned. But oh no, not Jesus. He wasn't even mad. Here's where Jesus shows his rad behavior. He says, daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith had made thee whole. Go in peace. What? I bet the crowd was looking like, but she's a woman. And she broke the law. And she touched a rabbi. He could have been made unclean. Did you see what he said? But Jesus was modeling for the crowd at that moment a different level of respect for women, a different level of respect for sick folk who should not be shunned by an entire society based on something that's not true. She couldn't touch them and make them unclean. And Jesus tried to show them that. What a radical. Now, he could have just healed her and kept on walking. Only he and the woman with the issue of blood would actually know that a healing had taken place. But you can't steal from God, like I said, that's number one. God needed to be glorified in this moment. And all who witnessed this miracle needed to understand that it was her faith in God and in touching him that healed her from a 12-year plague. Instead of being repulsed and disgusted, Jesus taught the community how this woman was to be treated. He responds to her. He responds to her with acceptance. He responds to her with understanding. He calls her daughter. He accepts her and offers her peace. And of course, the virtue that was flowing out of him heals her. Men and women of God, this bleeding woman's story interacts with all of our stories. Even though we live in today's contemporary society, if you think about it, just like her, we all have a need of healing at some point in our lives. At some point, we have been the outcast, or we have felt abandoned, maybe by our families or our communities, or maybe even our friends. Sometimes we have been in need of a merciful touch from God. Have you ever been there before? Have you ever been in that space? Were you able to reach Jesus in that space? Has there ever been a time that you were at wit's end? You had done all that you could do and you could not see your way out. Was your faith strong? Were you able to call out to God and he heard you? I hope so. But just in case, when unfortunate things happen to us, I want us to think about what God is teaching us in this moment. What is God saying to us in the context of this story? Now, I think that when we think about this story of the woman with the issue of blood, remember that it's not always about being healed. He can use this story for other things. It can also be about what it looks like for us when we need to reach Jesus, when we need to reach out to Jesus in times of grief and in pain and in heartache, in times of isolation and loneliness. And when we reach out, we have to have enough faith enough to believe and to receive this one great truth. And that is that you are loved, we are loved, that we are seen by him, that we are known intimately by our Creator, and that when he calls us daughter, and he calls us son. Healing doesn't always have to be like a physical restoration. Can be. But sometimes healing looks like acceptance. Sometimes it looks like belonging. Sometimes it can look like connection. Sometimes healing looks like not letting fear have a stronghold in your life. Sometimes healing can come from a loving touch of a friend or a loved one, and that's the difference we can make to people. In a moment of grief or hopelessness or deep pain or despair, that loving touch can draw us out and can remind us that we are loved, that we are called children of God. So let us use this woman's story to remind us that when we have areas where we need to be healed, we've got to press our way. We got to press our way for our healing. We have to have faith, enough faith to believe that we can be made whole. God bless you, Zion Temple, and to you, our listening audience. And I'll turn it back over to Reverend Hearn.